Welcome back to the instructional video series of the Agon Institute of Sports Ministry for our models, 21st century models of sports ministry course. We're in a second segment with our topic of Dr. Thomas Arnold. And Arnold was the premier educational person in that day and age, in the mid-1800s. And in fact, much of today's instructional and teaching, educational kinds of methodology still has a root with Thomas Arnold and his son. And in fact, a lot of even today's education courses talk about him very highly. The pictures that you're seeing in your PowerPoint are artist renderings of Rugby School, and the pictures, the real-life pictures, are those that I've taken as I've done my field work and research into these. Well, we've brought Thomas Arnold out of being the headmaster, principal, if you will, at Laleham, and now he's at Rugby. Now, one of the things I need to disabuse you of is that Rugby was not a school where people went to learn how to play the sport of rugby, but rather it was a school, a very strong academic school, along with Eton and Derby. These schools, Repton School at Derby in England, were like three of the most profoundly influential schools of the day, and still are to a large degree. But rugby, the sport of rugby, evolved. It was created at Rugby School. It wasn't a school for rugby. It was an academic institution that the sport of rugby grew out of, and grew out of Arnold's influence and culture that he instilled there. Well, your first PowerPoint there says that Arnold inherited over 100 students, and it grew quickly to over 300. And he set out to change the tone at Rugby. He wanted not only to be the headmaster, but also the chaplain. And so this meant that he would teach in this classroom, but he would also become the chaplain. He became ordained. He would do the preaching, and he wanted to do the deepening of the spirituality of the school without increasing the chapel times. He didn't equate chapel time numerics with overall spirituality. He wanted to become much more part and parcel of everyday life. He believed that the headmaster was called of God to make the school a Christian school. Go to your next slide there, and you begin to see some of these roles that he played. The role of chaplain. You see him preaching. And he did preach constantly in these services to students. And in fact, he assembled whole books that had nothing to do except have all of his preaching written out so they could read these sermons. And these sermons were more addresses or talks. They were very relevant. They were always in respect to the nature of temptation that these young men would face, and at that point it was only men that were under his tutelage. They were of a practical nature, and that he was trying very much to help his students grow and face these temptations. Well, the next picture shows him in his office, sitting across his desk. And this is where he would take the role of being a real mentor to these students. He would take the role of sitting down with them one-on-one. He wanted Christianity to become moment by moment. He could not tolerate the idea of separating the sacred from the everyday, the secular, if you will. He believed that Christianity needed to be learned how to be lived moment by moment, and that the sacred needed to be very present with us each and every second of each and every day. He believed that the Bible addressed all new areas that would come up, and thus biblical disciplines should be taught because they could cover everything. In your next PowerPoint slide, you'll see a picture of Thomas Hughes, one of his students, one of Arnold's students, who has come back to this altar at Rugby School, where he had heard Arnold preach so many times and where he had been encouraged to pray as a young prep student. And you see something very significant here, because Arnold believed that prayer was very much part and parcel of the life of the students. This is where students would develop their spirituality, was to have this really significant and personal and intense and deep relationship with Jesus Christ. And he believed that prayer became increasingly important, and he pushed it particularly for the upperclassmen, because he believed that they could understand it more than could some of the younger men. For the younger men, he thought it was more rote, and it certainly needed to be a learned behavior and pattern and habit. But for the older, that they were beginning to able to incorporate into their lives more. Well, let's go a little further with this Thomas Hughes. And at the risk of confusing you, we're going to talk about 4 Toms here. The first Thomas, of course, was Thomas Arnold. The second one now is his protege, Thomas Hughes. And it was Hughes then that wrote about a third Tom, Tom Brown. Tom Brown was a fictional character, and Tom Brown was Thomas Hughes' views of the student at Rugby School and under the tutelage of Thomas Arnold. And so you get a sense of Thomas Hughes' views about what it was like to be a student of Thomas Arnold's through his writings about Tom Brown. Tom Brown continues to be relevant in our society. Within about 10 years, the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, actually did a series of videos of Tom Brown, because it's so much a part of their culture. Now, his novels, Tom Hughes' novels, began to influence others. And the entire result of that era of Arnold's educational principles and teachings and Rugby School and Hughes's novels became what we now know as the muscular Christianity era. If you go to your next PowerPoint, you'll see a statue, a real-life statue of Thomas Hughes, the author. You see, Hughes became an incredibly influential person then in that era. And I'm going to read some quotes here from some of the books that you'll see here. Here are 3 key concepts that Hughes got through about this muscular Christianity movement, and which you might begin to consider for your models of your sports ministry. First one, he felt it was especially repugnant. What was especially repugnant was the belief that Christianity was not a faith for fighters. Not a faith for fighters. He found that repugnant. And he believed that the greatest fighting done was by those who believed they fought under God. And so he really believed that if you believed in God, that you would fight even harder. B, he admitted that war was evil unless it is the clear path of supreme duty. C, he believed that games, sports and recreation, he believed that they served the important function of strengthening the body, but also the mind. And both body and mind were given by God, and therefore must be developed, must be strengthened. And so these games were important. Sport was important for their educational, their disciplinary, and their value instilling functions. He said, quote, perfection of character to be reached by moral effort, end quote. Now, this book goes on to say that by participation in sport, boys could learn lessons and develop values that would act as an ethical leavening to permeate the larger non-sport world. So these thoughts then went on to influence a 4th Tom, Thomas Carlyle, who along with Tom Hughes and with Charles Kingsley began this whole muscular Christianity movement. And in fact, it was Carlyle, or rather Kingsley, that was credited to coin the phrase muscular Christianity through his novels, especially 2 that I would recommend that you would read, Westward Ho, and 2 Years Ago. That's the name of the book, 2 Years Ago. These concepts that were embodied in Hughes's Tom Brown's novels came through in Kingsley's characters as well. And these three men were very much part of the idea that mankind could reach perfection and that there needed to be a spiritual strength that came about, a robustness of the faith, and thus muscular Christianity. One last idea here, and that's the statue that you see. And when it was unveiled, the sculptor immediately fainted when he realized that he had left out the buttonholes in the Thomas Hughes coats. He was so disturbed that he eventually even committed suicide. Now, suicide is not one of the models that we hope that you get in this course, but we are hoping that there are many models that you are getting. We're going to continue this in our third session on Thomas Arnold when we talk about his legacy next time. I'm Dr. Greg Linville for the Agone Institute of Sports Ministry. Thanks for joining.